So good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. I see people from all over the world. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's History of Anti-Semitism program about Mendel Beilis. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark and Speaking Up, Confronting Hate Speech. You can learn more about both of those exhibitions and all the other ones we have on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. And I just saw a question that's coming in. This program is being recorded. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Robert Weinberg. Robert is the Isaac Clothier Professor of History and International Relations at Swarthmore, where he has taught for 35 years. His research has focused on the Revolution of 1905 in Odessa, pogroms, anti-Semitism, the Jewish Autonomous Region, anti-Judaism campaigns, and the Jewish question. You can buy his book, Blood Libel in Late Imperial Russia, The Ritual Murder Trial of Mendel Beilis, at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Robert.
Okay. Okay, I want to share my screen, but I don't have that icon yet.
Oh, it's not coming up for you?
No, it's not.
Okay, hang on one sec. Let me try now.
I see chat, raise hand. Oh, share, I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
All right, there we go.
Okay, so, okay. Well, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. As I was saying to Sydney before we started, one of the only benefits of the pandemic is Zoom, as far as I'm concerned. It makes this kind of programming much easier to organize. I also want to thank Laurie Bernstein, who did a great job with the PowerPoint slides that you're going to see. So all the credit goes to her for her hard work. And I'm going to begin. On the morning of Sunday, March 20th, 1911, a group of children playing in the caves that dotted a hilly suburb overlooking the city of Kiev made a gruesome finding: the blood-soaked body of a partially clad boy propped up against the cave's wall. His body was drained of most of its blood, a result of some 4 dozen stab wounds to the head, neck, and torso. The police summoned to the scene had no difficulty establishing the boy's identity because his name, Andrei Yushinsky, was written inside some school notebooks lying nearby. 13-year-old Andrei had been reported missing by his mother earlier in the week. Last seen when he supposedly left for school in the morning of Saturday, March 12th, Andrei skipped class to visit his friend Zhenya Chebyryak, who lived near the caves, and play with some of the neighborhood children on the premises of a brick factory next to the 2-storied house where Zhenya's family occupied the top floor. Police investigators initially suspected Andrei's family of the killing, but they soon turned their attention to Vera Chebyryak, the 30-year-old mother of Zhenya and the ringleader of a gang of petty thieves who used her apartment to fence stolen goods. According to the initial investigation, the gang killed Andrei because it feared he had told or would tell the police about their criminal activities. But Vera, who had close ties to vocal anti-Semitic right-wing activists in Kiev, insisted that the killing was in fact a ritual murder carried out by Kievan Jews. She pointed the police in the direction of Menachem Mendel Beilis, the Jewish manager of the adjacent brick factory. To anti-Semites, Andrei's murder was a case right in line with the centuries-old Blood Libel, which claimed Jews needed Christian blood preferably of Gentile youths, to bake their Passover matzahs. Seizing on the murder of Yushchinski as proof of Judaism's malevolent and murderous nature, they convinced the local prosecutor's office to pursue the murder as a ritual killing. Ignoring the detective originally assigned to the case, who suspected that many of the multiple stab wounds were inflicted after the boy's murder, just to make the killing resemble a ritual one, government officials set out to find a Jew whom they could pin the crime on. And the Minister of Justice in St. Petersburg gave the go-ahead. In mid-July 1911, the police detained Beilis, the 37-year-old Jewish brick factory manager, near the cave where the body was found. For more than 2 years, tsarist officials manufactured evidence and suborned perjury in an effort to build their case. But because the government lacked any forensic evidence linking Beilis to the murder, it concentrated its efforts on establishing the supposed ritual aspect of the murder. Beilis languished in jail for over 2 years. By the time of the trial in the fall of 1913, the Beilis case had become an international cause célèbre that attracted the attention of Jews and non-Jews alike. In the end, the jury acquitted Beilis of murder. But the jurors agreed with the prosecution that the crime indeed displayed the hallmarks of a ritual murder. Beilis's ordeal had the dubious distinction of being the best known and most publicized case of blood libel, as the ritual murder accusation was labeled in modern times. But it was a murder without a mystery, except for why officials in Kiev and St. Petersburg, including Tsarist ministers of justice and interior, railroaded an innocent man who came close to being convicted for a crime he did not commit. When I talk about the Beilis affair, my students understandably want to know where this idea that Jews use Gentile blood for matzah comes from. So what I want to do in the next 30 minutes or so is talk about the history of the blood libel in general and the role it specifically played in Tsarist politics and society at the turn of the 20th century. Moreover, I want to explore what the concept of blood libel tells us about the nature of anti-Semitism and what historians refer to as the Jewish question, as well as the nature of Russian imperial society on the eve of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. Let's start with the so-called Jewish question, which comes in myriad forms, but all its manifestations share a common characteristic. Jews are seen as an alien group of people who do not fit into mainstream society and are intent on oppressing and exploiting non-Jews through control of the economy, in particular commerce, banking, industry, and finance. Jews get accused of nefarious business practices and taking advantage of non-Jews by manipulating the stock market and lending money at high rates. A fundamental aspect of the Jewish question has remained consistent over time, namely that certain characteristics of Jewish life and society jeopardize, if not exploit and oppress, the non-Jewish community. In Tsarist Russia, the Jewish question encompassed more than economics. It touched upon all aspects of Jewish life, from culture and religion to politics and affairs of state. Prior to and after 1917, the Tsarist and communist governments regarded Jews and Judaism as dangers to mainstream culture. Jews were seen as stubborn, unwilling, and unable to fit into the world of their Gentile neighbors. Jews were exploiting non-Jews, and they were politically unreliable and enemies of Christians and the Tsarist and communist state. Essentially, attitudes towards Jews reflected deep-seated prejudices that tagged them as insular, clannish, and inimical to all things non-Jewish. The Jewish question essentially requires us to ask, what does it mean for a society to view an entire group of people as a fundamental threat to its well-being? The accusation that Jews engage in the murder of Christians, especially young boys and girls, dates back to the Middle Ages. The charge emerged in 12th century England when Jews were said to have murdered Christian youths in order to mock the Passion of Christ. By the middle of the 13th century, the belief that Jews killed Christians because Judaism demanded them to do so had spread to the European continent. Jews were now accused of needing Gentile blood for certain religious rituals, such as the baking of matzah. And Jewish men apparently needed to replenish blood too. According to some fakakta myth, they needed to replenish the blood they supposedly lost during menstruation. Basic to these myths was the belief and accusation that Judaism required Jews to engage in blood sacrifice, hence the label Blood Libel. My students are always stunned when I tell them about this. It's belies their imagination. The Blood Libel became well entrenched in popular culture and was reinforced in the teachings of many clergy, despite the fact that church officials on the highest levels did not necessarily buy this fabrication. The Vatican, for example, insisted that Jews did not require Gentile blood to bake matzah, but it was powerless to stop the belief, not only on parishioners, but priests as well. The disappearance of a child, especially in the springtime during the Passover and Easter holidays, was often sufficient to raise the cry of ritual murder. If the child's body turned up bruised or mutilated, that was a great excuse for local authorities to arrest, torture, and at times execute Jews in the effort to find the guilty party or parties. As a result of their expulsion from German-speaking lands and the allure of economic opportunities in Eastern Europe, the majority of European Jews migrated eastward to something we call the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And as Jews migrated to the east, so did the Blood Libel. Until the 19th century, however, the Russian Empire remained immune from the ritual murder accusation, mostly because there weren't really any Jews permitted to live and reside in tsarist lands until the late 18th century. That's when Catherine the Great grabbed a big share of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and divided it up among Russia, and the Austrian Empire. And by doing so, Catherine the Great incorporated hundreds of thousands of Jews and some 5 million Catholics into the Russian Empire. These new imperial subjects brought with them their popular beliefs and prejudices. These new imperial subjects brought their beliefs and prejudices, as I just said, including ones about ritual murder. Over the course of the 19th century, Russian Orthodox inhabitants of Tsarist Russia embraced this accusation, evident in sporadic investigations and trials of Jews accused of ritual murder that took place in small towns and cities. A series of books and government commissions explored the issue. By 1900, belief in the Blood Libel had become commonplace among a broad cross-section of the non-Jewish population. Still, it was not until the Beilis affair that the myth acquired global prominence. During the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the Blood Libel also experienced a renaissance in Central Europe, German-speaking in Europe in particular. It was very much alive at the turn of the 20th century. Dozens of ritual murder accusations left their traces in newspapers, parliamentary proceedings, and trials in Imperial Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many Jews found themselves under suspicion for crimes they did not commit and became the focus of public debates and government attention. Violence against Jewish communities erupted in the aftermath of these accusations, especially in small towns and villages. This uptick in the number of ritual murder accusations was not, however, simply the continuation of pre-Enlightenment religious prejudices and popular superstition. Anti-Semitism in general and the ritual murder myth in particular are not static phenomena, but are historically contingent. They may have a long intellectual, cultural, and political lineage, but their manifestations, motivations, and justifications have changed over time. Part of the reason for the revival of the Blood Libel in the final decades of the 19th century was the granting of Jews civil and political rights in Germany and the Habsburg Empire. Opponents of these changes turned to the political arena to limit, if not undo, the enfranchisement of Jews, which was seen as a byproduct of democratization. Unlike England or France, German-speaking Europe was less welcoming to liberalism, and therefore Jewish emancipation easily became a testing ground for conservative nationalist activists who felt threatened by rapid socioeconomic and political changes. As some historians have argued in recent years, the Blood Libel was in fact a consequence of modernity, and its adherents found sustenance in modern science, medicine, and forensic and criminology. There is no doubt that the social, economic, and political dislocation caused by modernization and a broad understanding of the term provided fertile soil for the blood libel. Jews were held responsible for the disruptions and challenges brought about by industrialization, urbanization, democratization, other social, cultural, and political phenomena associated with the modern world. The Jewish question was one way to combine the various strains of anti-Semitic thought and behavior into an overarching worldview that attributed all the ills of modern Europe to a specific group of people. Resolving the Jewish question would, in the minds of anti-Semites, eliminate the myriad shortcomings and difficulties of life in the early 20th century. Essentially, the Christian religious anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages and early modern Europe had been replaced by a social and political anti-Semitism that had begun to acquire racialized anti-Jewish coloration in many parts of Europe. And here are some examples of a very anti-Semitic French publication that appeared in the 1880s, 1890s, with very standard tropes of Jews trying to control and dominate the world. But let me add that it is important to acknowledge that the transition from pre-modern religious anti-Semitism to the more familiar modern form was incomplete in Tsarist Russia at the time of the trial of Beilis. One telling indicator of this incomplete transition are the words of a prominent advocate of the blood libel who scoffed at Beilis's defenders because they did not permit themselves to believe that there, and here I'm quoting, could be ritual murders in the century of airplanes and trams. The trial of Beilis speaks to the persistence of the religious foundations of the blood libel, especially in late Imperial Russia. There would be no ritual murder accusation without the existence of Judaism, whose texts were twisted and misrepresented and misinterpreted to lend credence to the claim that Jews needed the blood of Gentiles for Jewish rituals and practices. Religious prejudice and antipathy played a major role in the Beilis affair, along with political and social concerns, which I will address shortly. And here's one cartoon, and this is from right after the Beilis trial was over. And here's the translation. It's in Yiddish and Russian, although all in the Russian alphabet. And here are some Jews praying to Beilis, who's sitting on the throne. And I assume this is a large circle of matzah. And I assume this is a reference to the pointed tool that the coroner assumed was used to stab Yushchinsky several dozen times. Okay. The prosecutor called witnesses who insisted, based on erroneous and uninformed readings of Judaic texts such as the Talmud, that Jews were religiously obliged by Judaism to use the blood of Gentile youths. One such witness was Ivan Sikorsky, a prominent psychiatrist in Kiev who testified that several persons were involved in the killing of Yushchinsky in an attempt to maximize the draining of blood from the boy's body. He characterized the murder as racial revenge, a vendetta by one group of people. Though he didn't explicitly refer to this group of people as Jews, he did call them the sons of Jacob. He didn't leave too much to the imagination. And Sikorsky's son was I don't know if he created or invented the helicopter, but he's best known for developing the helicopter in the United States. And there's a museum to him in Connecticut, actually. A disgraced Roman Catholic priest, Justinus Prenatus, served as the prosecution's chief witness. The priest was one of the few men of the cloth to support publicly the ritual murder accusation, and his testimony reveals the willingness of the government to countenance any evidence, no matter how fanciful or weak. In 1892, Prenatus wrote a pamphlet in Latin purportedly proving that Judaism required the ritual sacrifice of Gentiles. But he fled to Tashkent soon after its publication because he was accused of extorting money from people in St. Petersburg. In 1911, however, the police allowed him to return to the capital and not face criminal charges after he agreed to testify on behalf of the government. On the stand, Pranatus asserted that the Talmud sanctioned the killing of non-Jews in order to hasten the arrival of the Messiah, as well as serve the important ritual function of blood sacrifice. He made a fool of himself. Beilis's defense team handily ripped the priest's testimony to shreds during cross-examination, exposing his utter ignorance of Judaism and the Talmud by demonstrating how he mistranslated texts because he could barely read Hebrew. Other weaknesses in the government's case were pointed out by defense witnesses who challenged the state's assertion that the wounds showed signs of the intentional cutting of blood vessels to facilitate the collection of blood. In addition, the supposed murder weapon and all would have had difficulty puncturing veins and arteries. Finally, someone intent on maximizing the collection of blood would not have stabbed the victim after he was dead. Forensic evidence demonstrated that many of the wounds were inflicted after the boy's death. And if you have watched as many police procedurals as I do, you know when somebody is dead, they do not spurt blood if you cut them. Now, why would high-ranking tsarist officials, not all of whom embraced the veracity of the blood libel, greenlight the railroading of Beilis? It seems likely that the Minister of Justice, who followed the trial carefully and had approved the arrest and prosecution of Beilis, hoped to curry favor with Tsar Nicholas II, who believed in the blood libel and probably thought Beilis was guilty of murder. The minister believed that the prosecution of Beilis would provide the autocratic regime with an ideological bulwark that would bolster autocratic principles, values, and policies. Moreover, officials were contending with demands by foreign organizations to government that Russia dismantle the Pale of Settlement and grant Russian Jews full legal and civil equality. If the Tsarist state could demonstrate that Jews did engage in behavior such as ritual murder, then the demands of detractors of Russia would lose their power. A successful prosecution of a Jew for ritual murder would prove the evil and duplicitous nature of Jews, thereby justifying the anti-Semitic policies and practices of the autocracy in the face of condemnation on the world stage. The Tsarist regime had compelling reasons, the reasoning went, to maintain the edifice of rules, regulations, and laws that discriminated against Jews. Officials, journalists, and right-wing activists could then proclaim that ritual murder was not a fantasy, but a reality acknowledged in the Russian courts, which enjoyed the respect of jurists in Europe. A successful prosecution would help to restore the tarnished image and reputation of the Tsarist regime, both at home and abroad. As I noted earlier, the jury did not find Beilis guilty of murder. In fact, they tied at 6-6, and according to Russian judicial rules, a tie went in favor of the defendant. So it wasn't that 6-6 tie was even amazing that the government succeeded in getting 6 votes because the government offered no forensic evidence linking Beilis to the crime. But the jury agreed with the prosecution that the murder had the hallmarks of a ritual murder. In other words, the government's case did not fall entirely on deaf ears since the jury accepted the ritual murder scenario. Proponents of the prosecution of Beilis took comfort in the jury's decision, notwithstanding the acquittal of Beilis. As Alexei Shmakov, a fervent believer in the blood libel, a rabid anti-Semite, and representative of the Ushinsky family proclaimed at the end of the trial, "We have no intention of reversing the sentence of the court because the sentence satisfies us. It was necessary for us to establish that the murder had a ritual character, and we were able to do so. The jurors knew that murder was carried out with the aim of obtaining blood. Had the jury said that the prosecution had not proven the ritual aspect of the murder, we would not have been satisfied, even if the jurors had found Beilis guilty of murder." I think he was just trying to put a good spin on the situation. Acquittal meant that Beilis's ordeal ended. He wanted nothing more than to return to his family and rebuild his life. His years in prison and the trial turned him into a public figure whose celebrity had captured the attention of people throughout the Russian Empire, Europe, and North America. He could not escape the prying eyes of the press and the scrutiny of the public. Only several weeks after his acquittal, 6 Yiddish theaters in New York staged plays about him in the trial, and similar productions soon took place elsewhere in the United States and Europe. In addition, a documentary and a film based on the trial showed in theaters at this time. Not surprisingly, Beilis had no money and needed to earn a living. Wealthy Jews in Europe and the US gave assurances they would provide for him and his family if they moved from Kiev. He was offered a lecture tour around the United States for $40,000, but he rejected that offer because he didn't want to travel for 20 weeks away from his family. Another offer entailed his moving to New York and becoming a greeter at a bank. He also harbored a dream of farming the land, and so he left Kiev for Tel Aviv after he started receiving death threats. Once in Tel Aviv, his children attended school and survived on whatever money benefactors in Kiev had given him. But promised funds from other well-to-do Jews did not materialize. A situation made worse by the outbreak of World War I and the freezing by a new German Jewish manager at the Anglo-Palestinian Bank of whatever money Beilis did have. He eventually took a series of dead-end jobs, unfulfilling jobs, and finally in the 1920s, he moved with his family to New York. He worked as a printer and a salesman, and even published his memoir, The Story of My Life. But he never found happiness in the United States, and he died at age 70 in 1934. Thousands of mourners attended his funeral at the Eldridge Street Synagogue on the left, and he was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Queens. And let me just conclude by noting that Beilis was, to the best of my knowledge, the last Jew to stand trial for the blood libel in Europe, though such accusations occurred in the 1920s, and the Nazis loved to write about ritual murder, but they never actually put anybody on trial for the blood libel. Furthermore, the blood libel is alive and well in the Middle East and on websites hosted by racist and white supremacist organizations. And here are some recent political cartoons that all are based on Jews needing blood, eating blood, or Jews engaged in some form of cannibalism. So let me end there. I'll be happy to take questions. I'm going to end my sharing of screen if I can. And I just did. Okay, screen. I didn't mean to do that, but it worked. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll take whatever questions you have, and I'll do my best to answer them.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation, Robert, and for sharing all of that with us. And yeah, please take a well-deserved drink of water. And for all of you out there, please feel free to continue putting questions in the chat and the Q&A box. And so while we kind of collect a few more questions, I'm going to start with one of my own. Can you talk about how you came across the story of Mendel Beilis? And it seems to be a little less well known in America, at least. So can you talk a bit about how you came?
Yeah, but if you read books about Jewish history in the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe and the United States, they all mention the Dreyfus Affair.
Mm-hmm.
They all mentioned Leo Frank, the lynching of Leo Frank in the South, and they mentioned the Beilis trial. So it wasn't unknown to me, and I can't recall why I thought of this, but I thought one day, maybe 20 years ago, that I would look at the trial transcripts, which are in a 3-volume collection and supposedly verbatim transcripts of the trial from every day it took place, and maybe translate them. But then I decided that was way too big a job. So I decided to select certain of the materials from the trial and write a short essay and annotate the documents. And so that's what this book is composed of. And so, and at the
Uh,
same time, there was somebody else who also wrote a history of the Beilis trial as well, Edmund Levin. So our books came out about the same time.
Thank you so much. So another question that has come in is, did any liberal Russian political figures or intellectuals protest the trial?
They did. Most of them did. And some of them were involved in the defense of Beilis, and they certainly wrote editorials and articles condemning the trial of Beilis and condemning the myth of the ritual of the blood libel and so on. So there was no shortage of people on the political left defending Beilis and condemning the prosecution and the government's decision to stage the trial.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions that I'm going to combine into one just because they're all along the same lines. What is different about the Beilis case versus other cases of blood libel that we may have heard of? Is there anything that differentiates it?
Well, the cases beforehand never really, the ones in Imperial Russia didn't have the benefit of the court proceeding system as it developed after the 1860s. There were some trials, but for the most part, they were investigations by government commissions or officials. So they had to wade through the evidence. But this was, and in Europe prior to the 19th century, usually it could have been the church or local officials that were pursuing the charges. And so they never had the benefit of this kind of defense that they had in Russia. I mean, I think having a very vibrant defense occurring in an open courtroom where journalists from all over the world were stationed makes a big difference. And I think that's probably what accounts for the major distinction. I hadn't thought of that before, but I'd say it's the fact that he got a fair trial for the most part.
Thank you. And so I'm just going to kind of read this one as it came in. Given the emphasis on the ritualization of the murder, did that spill over into any other anti-Semitic problems after the trial?
Actually, officials were afraid that there would be anti-Jewish violence, pogroms, because of the acquittal, but there were no plans that I could find being hatched by right-wing activists, and there was no trouble at all. So things seem to have quieted down. And, it also, and then, a year later, World War I breaks out. And so people are busy thinking about other matters. So it's not until the aftermath of the Russian seizure of power, and actually before even the Bolsheviks take power, the provisional government that replaces the autocracy begins to investigate a lot of these government officials for malfeasance and bribery and so on, and the Bolsheviks continue it. And some people are prosecuted as well.
Gotcha. Did authorities ever discover who actually murdered the child? And if not, are there any kind of theories today about what happened?
No, there's one book that came out, I don't know, in 20, 30 years ago, I guess, that thinks that there may have been I wouldn't call it a serial killer, but a killer in the area that had been killing children. So it's not clear. They never found anybody. And what has always bothered me is supposedly they killed Yushinsky on a Saturday afternoon, but it wasn't until I think Monday or Tuesday they moved the body to the cave. So it was sitting in the apartment of Vera Cheburak, the mother and the ringleader of the gang of thieves. And it's March, so it may still be cold in Russia, but I don't know, bodies begin to smell. So I don't understand how they were able to live with that odor, even if it was a short period of time. So I don't know, there's some, but it seems to be, the evidence seems to indicate that it was her gangs based on the testimony of some other people who lived in the first floor of that building, but we really don't know.
Thank you. And we have another question that's asking who the defense lawyers were and were they prominent at all?
Yes, one defense lawyer was Oscar Grusenberg, who was a very well-known Jewish lawyer. Some other names are evading my memory right now. There was one, a Maklikov, and there were two brothers. One was a right-wing minister for the tsarist government and a liberal brother, Maklikov, and he was one of the leaders of the Cadet Party, which was the Constitutional Democratic Party, the mainstream liberal party as well. But there were a few others that were well known. There must have been 4 or 5 at the trial at all times.
And did they become involved because they were liberal or
Yeah, they were liberal. They wanted to defend Beilis. Not all of them were Jews, but I think they thought this was a miscarriage of justice, and they wanted to defend Beilis and the Jews of Russia from this bogus accusation. And I imagine they were also hoping to strike some blows against the autocracy as well.
And I know you said that you did not translate the court transcripts, but have they been translated at all into English?
No, not a complete set. The documents I have in my book, I did the translation, but that's just a smattering of the documents of all the testimony. I'm not aware of any English translation. That would be a nice thing to do, but I don't have the time, and I don't think my Russian is up to the task.
Sure. Well, we'll wait in the future, and I'm sure.
Well, maybe somebody will do it. It's several thousand pages, so I guess one could do it as a labor of love and post it on a website somewhere and never assume it's going to be published in paper.
Yeah, and that actually leads into another question that came in. Can you clarify how long the trial was exactly?
Yeah, the trial was about 5 weeks, most of the month of October, but I think it started at the very end of September. So 4 to 5 weeks. It was over, I think, October 28th. And I just see something in the chat, the Beilis transcripts. That's not the full version, but they do have a lot. There's a lot in there. And I suppose AI could possibly translate it, but I'm reading another chat. So yeah, somebody should.
Gotcha. And so we actually have a lot of people mentioning The Fixer by Malamud. Can you comment on that a bit?
I can say that the the Beilis family has sued Malamud for copyright infringement. I don't know the details, but it's been going on for a long time. I don't think it's ever going to be settled. It's a loose adaptation of what happened to Beilis. All I remember from The Fixer, when I saw the movie with Alan Bates, he sleeps with a Gentile woman, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was a Jewish prostitute. That didn't happen. He didn't do that. So I think, but it's been a long time since I read The Fixer or looked at the movie. So I just don't remember, but it's a loose adaptation outside of the fact that there was this trial of Beilis, and he was acquitted.
Thank you. So we have a lot of people who are asking, why do you think blood libel is such a persistent, is so persistent?
Because my feeling is anti-Semitic beliefs, prejudices are just rooted in popular society. And I think social media can stir up the pot. People will find all sorts of materials on the web and not think about them critically. And as we know, people believe in conspiracy theories, and there's conspiracy that Jews are wanting to take over the world and to kill and dominate Christians has been around for many years. So I think it's a weaponization of a particular anti-Semitic slur. And right, it's a way for people to make sense of something that they don't understand or don't like. And so that's why you can find all this stuff on the web. It doesn't take much to look for it, or YouTube, I imagine. You could take probably a study course on the ritual murder on YouTube by someone who put it together.
We also have a question about where does sort of the blood part of blood libel come from? Why is blood such a big kind of thing in
I
that?
think this is a good question. And the explanation that I liked the most was put forth by a historian at Stanford who studied the blood libel in the Middle Ages. And he thinks it may have been that when Christians took the sacraments in church, right, it's sort of, and actually thought about what they were doing, because it's supposed to be literally the blood and body of Christ that they're drinking and eating, that if they thought about it, was a little unsettling. And so they sort of just projected onto Jews. And so Jews are engaged in these behaviors. They would stab the Eucharist. They need blood for ritual sacraments, red wine as a substitute. So I think you may have to ask people who believe in the myth why they do. And I think you'd probably get some very interesting answers if they really engage with the question, rather than it's just what I believe. But I think it's something to do with what is the term in Catholicism? I cannot remember, but it's a response to the fact that when you take the sacraments in church, you're actually imbibing the blood and body of Christ.
Thank you. So I know you mentioned the fixer might not be the best kind of portrayal of the Beilis trial, but are there any portrayals that you would recommend, or any other kind of books or films that people should read to learn more about blood libel and maybe this case more specifically?
Yeah, well, I mean, I imagine the two authors, and I know you had Magda Teeter speak, who's knows all about blood libel in Catholic lands, and was written about it to the 19th century, and especially Poland. But there's a historian of Czech Jewry, Hillel Kieval, Kieval, and he's written about several blood libel trials in the 1880s and 1890s in Hungary and so on. And there's one other book called The Butcher's. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll look at
No, you're all good. Take your time.
The Butcher's Tale by Helmut Walzer Smith. So these are all very good discussions of sort of trials. There's also one that talks about the Dreyfus Affair, Leo Frank and Beilis, the Jew accused. And if you want, I can write these down and then
Yeah, send them to me and
send
I'll send them out to our audience
Yeah.
afterwards. Be great. And actually another question that came in, and you're providing so many great segues. Can you talk a little bit about the links, like why the Frank, the Frank trial, the Dreyfus affair, and the Beilis affair are kind of linked, it seems, quite often.
Because it all happened within a period of 15 years or so, 1898. Oh, Dreyfus affair starts in mid 1890. So in a period of, the 25 years before the outbreak of World War I, you have these very well-known scandals, and Jews figure prominently in them. One, in the case Jews, Jew is a traitor, Jew is a ritual murderer, and Leo Frank, Jew is a someone who preys upon Christian women, young Christian women. So you have all these tropes that stem from long-term prejudices, but also concerns of, did we grant citizenship to Jews erroneously? I mean, here's a Jew who was a captain in the French army who supposedly have sold secrets to France's enemy, the Austrian Empire. So they got a lot of press. So I think it sort of makes sense to discuss them all together, though each one had its separate characteristics.
Thank you for that. And I think this might be a bit of a hard one, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Because we still see blood libel popping up today as something that Jews are accused of, and as a sort of signal for Jews doing bad things in the world. Like, do you have any suggestions on how to sort of fight that and how to spot that when it's happening?
Good question. I think one way to reduce it is, I guess we could just ban social media. That's not going to happen. So, I teach, I'm an educator, and I always think education is the best way to combat a lot of this prejudice. But it's also, you have to get hold of, your paths may not cross with people who believe this, in these conspiracies and these myths. So I think getting to know each other may be the way. In some cases, I remember listening to a podcast where it turns out this Black jazz musician befriends an older white person who was listening to jazz, and this white man was the Grand Wizard of the KKK, and changed entirely after actually having beers with this Black jazz musician. So people can change, but you have to have the opportunity, and I think those are few and far between. But I don't know, I always ask my students, I say, when we read or talk about the ritual murder, I said, has anybody heard of this? And nobody. And I said, that's good, because if you did, you either heard it, I would like to think you heard it about in another history course, because otherwise you're picking it up from some anti-Semites that you're interacting with, and that I wouldn't be happy about. So, so far so good.
Yeah,
But that's Swarthmore College, so I don't know.
Yeah, and how do your students kind of react when you teach this to them?
The Jewish students are just stunned. They say this is totally ridiculous, and the Gentile students never heard of it. And
Yeah.
Same as the Jewish students. So they're just they want to ask the same kinds of questions that the audience asked, or that we try to address in articles and books. I mean, it's, people are susceptible to this, and if you harbor anti-Semitic prejudices or anti-religious, anti-Judaic prejudices, you're more susceptible to believing these stories, right? You go into a synagogue in 1900, everything is conducted in Hebrew. Nobody, if you're not Jewish, you're not going to understand what's going on for the most part. So somebody can spread all sorts of rumors about it, and it takes root.
And so, and I apologize if I'm missing any questions. We have a lot coming in, so I'm trying to keep up with them, but I see a couple others that have come in. What I'll just kind of read this as it came in. Darwinist theories have supported depicting Jews as outside normal evolution, which writers like Chekhov incorporated. My question is, what is the influence of these stereotypes on the Beilis prosecution, and whether Russian writers alive then protested?
I didn't know about Chekhov's embrace of Darwin. There was one major writer, Korolenko, who wrote a lot about the trial and condemned what was going on. So some literary figures who were well known at the time did raise their voices in opposition to it. So, and Darwin certainly was known in Russia at the turn of the 20th century. So, they would have known of some of his ideas.
Mhm.
But I haven't come across, I haven't looked down in this path of investigation about which writers and how many. But I think many did have an opinion condemning it.
And I know we are kind of getting to the end of our time, so I just want to ask a couple more questions. Can you tell us where we can find out more about your work and kind of what you have coming up next?
You can just go to my website, I suppose.
Okay.
Type in my name at Swarthmore College. And you can find my website.
Great.
And I have a list of the various publications I have. And right now I'm searching for a project, although I have one in the back of my mind that I have collected material on. It's going to be on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this fabrication from the early 20th century that lays out the Jewish effort to dominate and control the world.
Yeah.
And it still is, it's lots of airtime these days, and you can still take copies of it. So I'm not quite sure what to do. But
yeah, that's really a big topic to take on for sure.
Looking at my binders to the left, and would have all this material sitting that I haven't looked at yet.
Yeah, that's a lot for sure.
Yeah, part of the problem is you just can't pick up and go to Russia these days to do any research. So you have to sort of be creative and see what's available.
Yes. And then we do have somebody asking, is it possible to get a signed copy of the book?
I suppose. If they wanted to send me a copy, I'd be happy to sign it. I'll send it back.
Okay.
And you can get my address at the history department at the college. And I'll be happy to sign it and send it back and use the college's money for postage. So don't worry about a self-addressed envelope or package. It's not not that big or heavy, so I'll be able to put it in a little mailer and it'll be safe and sound.
Great. And do you kind of have any final remarks or anything you really want us to remember from this story in this case?
That people will just believe all sorts of bizarre stories, and I mean we live with it on a daily basis, and it's quite possible, I didn't mention this, that even some of the figures on the prosecution team didn't really believe it, but they went ahead as if it was real because they thought it was a good career move, or they thought it would please superiors and so on, or they wanted to blame Jews for the shortcomings of the Russian government. So you should always look at this, I would just encourage people to look and see who's behind the information that you're reading. It's right, and see, what is this organization? Sounds perfectly legitimate, but we have Google, you can do a quick search and you can sort of read between the lines and get a sense of who's promoting this this rumor or this fabrication. So, I just ask people to be vigilant and think critically about what they read.
Well, thank you so much for all of this, for answering all of these questions.
Thank you.
It's really been a pleasure.